In the late 19th century, London stood as a city of industrial progress, burgeoning intellectual thought, and rapid scientific discovery. Yet, amid all this growth, there was an eerie, lesser-known side of the city, one filled with the suffering of countless people whose afflictions were often ignored or misunderstood. One such affliction, strange as it may seem today, was loneliness. At the time, loneliness wasn't just a state of mind or a fleeting emotional experience. It was considered a disease, one that could be treated, diagnosed, and even hospitalized for. It was in this peculiar context that a little-known institution was founded in London, one that would go down in medical history as a symbol of both the terrifying misunderstandings of mental health and the dark, uncharted territories of psychiatric treatment. This was a place where isolation was prescribed as a cure, where the most human of experiences was turned into something sinister, and where loneliness was seen as an affliction so great it could distort a person's soul and body. The story of this hospital, one of the first in the world to treat loneliness as a medical condition, is not merely a tale of bizarre psychiatry. It's a deep dive into a historical moment when society tried to make sense of mental health through methods that seem more like medieval remedies than the modern techniques we now take for granted. For anyone looking to understand the origins of mental health treatment and how far we've come, or perhaps how little we've learned, this is a story that will both disturb and intrigue. Loneliness, at the time, was not the solitary, temporary experience we often associate with the word today. In the late Victorian period, loneliness was seen as a disease, one that could erode a person's mind and physical health. It was recognized as something more than a mere emotional state. It was a sign of mental disrepair, a dangerous mental state that could spiral into madness if left untreated. Victorians viewed the mind with a mix of curiosity and fear, believing that mental health was a fragile, volatile condition, one that needed constant supervision and intervention. The mind wasn't just a place for ideas and thought. It was a fragile structure that could easily be shattered by society, isolation, or emotional turmoil. This hospital, though largely forgotten today, was one of the institutions that tried to confront loneliness as a disease. Unlike today's understanding of mental illness, which might approach loneliness through psychotherapy or medication, this hospital prescribed something far more strange and troubling: physical isolation. Patients were often segregated from others, placed in isolated rooms designed to mimic the conditions of their emotional suffering. The theory behind this was that loneliness itself was a contagious, debilitating illness, one that could only be cured through treatment methods that seemed almost medieval by modern standards. These patients were kept in rooms with barred windows, forced to stay in seclusion, their only cure being a strict, sometimes harsh regimen that sought to rein the mind and body. The hospital's treatments were experimental at best and cruel at worst. It was a time when psychiatric practices were not bound by ethical codes or scientific rigor. Doctors were still figuring out what mental health was, what caused it, and how it could be treated. Patients, many of whom had nothing but a simple, human need for connection, were subjected to treatments that seem impossible to comprehend today. The idea that loneliness could be cured by isolation was both tragic and telling of the limited understanding at the time. How could someone suffering from the absence of human connection be expected to heal in a place that denied them the very thing they needed most? As this hospital grew in notoriety, its practices became increasingly controversial. The medical community began to debate whether such a drastic approach could truly address what was essentially a human emotion, a feeling that everyone had experienced in one form or another. Was it right to treat loneliness with such severity? Or was this a misunderstood attempt to help individuals who had no other recourse? In the end, the hospital became a symbol of both the progress and the failings of psychiatric medicine in its early stages. The hospital itself was designed with this belief in mind. It was an institution that aimed to treat its patients not just for their mental afflictions but also for their lack of emotional connections. The rooms were stark, cold, and isolated, and patients were often confined for days, weeks, or even months without any real human interaction. The belief that solitude could somehow cure loneliness became a cornerstone of their practice. There were no common areas to foster interaction, no gardens to relax in, no open spaces for socialization. Instead, patients were separated from one another, left alone to confront the very thing that had brought them to the hospital in the first place. The physical space mirrored the very disease they were trying to treat, a disease that was, ironically, caused by a lack of connection, now exacerbated by forced isolation. While the doctors believed they were on the cutting edge of psychiatric care, society was beginning to shift its views. Victorians, while still struggling with many misconceptions about mental health, were slowly evolving in their understanding of human psychology. The idea that loneliness could be treated through more humanistic means was beginning to take hold. Yet, for many patients in this hospital, they were trapped in an outdated system of thinking, where isolation was considered a cure rather than a punishment. The doctors, despite their genuine belief in their methods, were operating on the edge of medical science, often without a clear understanding of the psychological damage they might be causing. In truth, the very nature of the hospital became a reflection of the darker side of 19th century psychiatry. It was an era that believed in the power of the mind to both heal and destroy, but it also lived in fear of that same mind. It wasn't uncommon for patients to be committed to institutions for reasons that would seem absurd by today's standards, being too nervous, fidgety, or even too sad. The medical community's understanding of what constituted mental illness was still developing, and the line between what could be medically treated and what was simply an emotional or psychological reaction to the pressures of life was blurry at best. Thus, patients who suffered from loneliness, an emotion so deeply tied to human experience, was seen as broken, even if there was nothing physically wrong with them. As the 20th century approached, the medical community slowly began to reject the isolationist approach to mental health, recognizing that true healing could only happen in environments of connection, not isolation. The idea that loneliness could be treated by simply keeping people alone seemed absurd in hindsight, but for the doctors of the time, it was one of the only ways they knew to try to alleviate the pain of their patients. It wasn't until later that psychiatry would evolve into a field that understood the power of social connection, therapy, and compassion in healing the mind. The hospital itself eventually faded into obscurity. Its methods were considered far too cruel, far too unscientific, and ultimately abandoned in favor of more compassionate approaches to mental health. Yet, its brief existence serves as a chilling reminder of how easily society can fall into the trap of believing that isolation is the solution to mental suffering. It also raises questions about how we, even in modern times, might misunderstand and mismanage mental health. Loneliness, now recognized as a serious issue in our society, still carries with it a deep stigma, and the medical community is only now beginning to understand the profound effects it can have on both the mind and the body. In this strange chapter of history, we are left with more questions than answers. What if loneliness truly is a disease that requires a cure? And if so, what is the right treatment? The legacy of the hospital that treated loneliness remains as a haunting example of how psychiatric care can become as misguided as it is well-intentioned. It's a story that forces us to examine not just the treatment of mental illness, but our understanding of the very emotions that make us human. The late 19th century was a time of immense change and upheaval. The Industrial Revolution had reshaped the world, bringing with it a new sense of scientific optimism, but it had also cast a long shadow of anxiety and uncertainty. With the rapid urbanization of cities like London, the understanding of mental health was still in its infancy, and many of the conditions we now understand were either overlooked, misunderstood, or seen through a lens of superstition and fear. While great minds were making strides in fields like physics, chemistry, and biology, psychiatry was still a relatively young and unstable discipline. Mental health care had yet to find its footing, and it wasn't uncommon for the sick to be subjected to cruel, inhumane treatments in the name of progress. Asylums had become the hallmark of psychiatric care during the Victorian era. These institutions were often grim, imposing buildings where the mentally ill were housed and treated, sometimes with methods that today would be considered barbaric. During this period, a vast majority of people were still unaware of the true nature of mental illness, and many viewed it as a moral failing rather than a medical condition. In a society that prided itself on outward respectability, it was seen as shameful to be mentally unwell. Those who fell victim to mental illness were often cast aside, locked away behind the walls of asylums, where their conditions were left untreated or exacerbated by the very environment meant to heal them. The emergence of psychiatry as a formalized medical discipline was still in its early days. The field had begun to branch off from the broader domain of general medicine, but it was a deeply speculative practice. The understanding of the brain and mental illness was rudimentary at best, with medical professionals relying heavily on crude methods and outdated theories. The treatments used in psychiatric institutions reflected this lack of knowledge. Bloodletting, electroshock therapy, and the use of sedatives were all common, yet none of these approaches were based on solid scientific understanding. Mental illness was still seen as an ailment of the body and soul, and there was little distinction between the two. The very idea that mental and emotional distress could be caused by something as intangible as a chemical imbalance in the brain would have been incomprehensible to most people at the time. Within this context, Many in the medical community were trying to make sense of the profound psychological suffering that was becoming more apparent. The rise of asylums reflected a growing desire to segregate the mentally ill from society, but it also created a darker, more insidious problem: how to define and treat those who did not neatly fit into existing diagnostic categories. For many, mental health was simply about being out of balance, a condition that could be addressed through confinement, treatment, or even reformation. The concept of mental illness was largely dominated by moral and social frameworks, with patients often labeled as morally flawed, possessed, or simply weak-willed. Those who suffered from mental distress due to societal pressures, poverty, isolation, or grief were often ignored or blamed for their own conditions. It was within this environment that the strange and controversial notion of loneliness being classified as a disease began to take root. At the time, the Victorian worldview was shaped by a heavy emphasis on social order, respectability, and outward appearances. Any deviation from the ideal of social participation or emotional well-being was seen as a failure, an illness in itself. Loneliness, in this context, became more than just an emotional state; it became a diagnosis. It was believed that prolonged solitude, a lack of human connection, could cause physical and mental deterioration. In some quarters, this belief was rooted in religious or moral views about the importance of human relationships, while in others, it reflected the emerging medicalization of human suffering. Some doctors began to see loneliness not as a temporary feeling, but as a pathological condition that could affect a person's physical health. The idea was not completely unfounded. Studies at the time were beginning to show that isolation could have negative effects on mental health. Solitude was understood to contribute to depression and anxiety, and it was seen as an environment where a person's mental state could worsen unchecked. The belief that a person could actually catch the disease of loneliness was, however, an exaggerated interpretation of these early studies. Some doctors hypothesized that loneliness could be as contagious as any other affliction, and the idea of treating loneliness as a disease took hold in some parts of the medical community. In practical terms, however, what was proposed as treatment for loneliness was little more than a reflection of the era's broader misunderstanding of mental health. Asylums were not just places where patients were segregated, they were also seen as sites of reform. A prevailing view held that by removing patients from the influences of society, they could be reformed or cured through isolation, routine, and even punishment. Loneliness, in this sense, became synonymous with moral failure, and those who exhibited symptoms of isolation were often blamed for their own affliction. Society at large had yet to understand the many layers of mental distress that could result from social isolation, trauma, or personal loss. Asylum doctors, especially those who pioneered the treatment of loneliness, were influenced by this prevailing thinking. They saw themselves as reformers, attempting to cure individuals who had succumbed to a state of emotional degradation. Many believed that once people were removed from the stresses and distractions of the outside world, they could return to a state of normalcy. In practice, this meant isolating patients even further, creating an environment where they would not only have little to no social contact but also where their every action would be monitored and controlled. The impact of this treatment was profound, but not in the way the doctors intended. Rather than offering healing, it seemed to exacerbate the very problem they sought to address. Loneliness was treated as a disease that could be cured by enforcing more of the very thing that caused it, solitude. The belief was that by confronting loneliness head-on, by keeping patients in isolation, they would be forced to reconcile with their own emotions. They would, it was thought, eventually snap out of it and return to a more socially acceptable state. But this kind of treatment, which reflected a deep misunderstanding of the human psyche, often left patients worse off than when they first arrived. The rise of asylums in the 19th century reflected a broader movement to medicalize social problems, such as mental illness, but it also underscored how easily the line between care and cruelty could become blurred. What was intended as a form of healing became a system of institutionalized suffering. And the treatment of loneliness as a disease was one of the most striking examples of how psychiatric care was intertwined with the cultural and social norms of the time. Mental illness was not simply seen as a biological or psychological phenomenon. It was also a moral and social judgment. It was an ailment to be dealt with by the medical establishment, which, at the time, was still grasping for answers in the dark. Despite the troubling nature of these treatments, they were a product of their time, a time when understanding mental illness was still in its infancy, when society had not yet fully embraced the idea of mental health as a complex and multifaceted issue. What we now understand as depression, anxiety, and loneliness were often viewed through the simplistic lens of moral weakness or the failure to conform to societal expectations. For those who found themselves struggling with isolation or emotional pain, the hospital system in place during the 19th century was not a refuge. It was a harsh, sometimes dangerous place that sought to treat symptoms rather than causes, to impose conformity rather than offer true healing. And yet, despite all of the failures and missteps of this early period in psychiatric care, it also laid the groundwork for future advancements in the field. Though the practices were flawed, the rise of asylums, the attempt to treat loneliness as a disease, and the effort to provide care for the mentally ill were all early steps toward understanding the complex nature of human psychology. This was the beginning of a medical journey that would ultimately lead to a more humane approach to mental health care. However, for the patients caught in these early institutions, this progress came too late. They were left to suffer in a system that neither understood nor cared for their emotional needs, and in many cases, they were left to die alone. The hospital that treated loneliness as a disease was far from typical in the landscape of late 19th century psychiatry. It was a place where conventional notions of mental health and emotional suffering were redefined, a place where the idea that loneliness itself could be a debilitating, diagnosable condition took root. But what did this strange diagnosis actually entail, and how did it come to be seen as a medical illness? To understand this, we must first delve into the cultural and medical thinking of the era, an era in which the mind was as much a mystery as the body, and emotional suffering was often misunderstood or ignored. In the late Victorian period, psychiatry was still a field in its infancy, with little understanding of the complexities of mental health. The mind was seen as a vast, largely unexplored frontier, and its disorders were often attributed to factors that seemed incomprehensible to modern thinking. The concept of mental illness was broad and vague, encompassing everything from severe psychosis to melancholia, with little regard for the subtleties of individual experiences. As a result, psychiatric diagnoses were often crude, based on a combination of medical theory, social judgment, and moral beliefs. Mental illnesses were often framed as moral failures or spiritual crises, rather than the biological or psychological conditions we understand them to be today. And in a society where appearances were paramount, any deviation from normal emotional or social behavior was seen as a potential disorder. Loneliness, then, was not simply an emotional state. It was a sign of something much more profound, a deep and potentially dangerous dysfunction of the mind. It was believed that prolonged loneliness, when left unchecked, could spiral into full-blown mental collapse, manifesting as depression, anxiety, or even madness. The idea that loneliness could become a disease in and of itself seemed logical in an age where emotional and mental health was still inextricably tied to social participation. Loneliness wasn't just the absence of company. It was a withdrawal from life itself, a disconnection from the world that could result in physical and mental deterioration. This view reflected the period's belief in the power of social relationships as the cornerstone of health and well-being. But why was loneliness singled out as a disease, and what did it mean to treat it as such? In the hospital that specialized in this treatment, loneliness was diagnosed as a pathological condition, one that could manifest in a variety of ways. The most common symptoms were feelings of isolation, sadness, and a lack of emotional connection to others. But the disease was not just an internal experience. It was seen as something that could affect a person's entire being. The loneliness, it was believed, could take root in the body, causing physical ailments such as exhaustion, loss of appetite, and even a weakening of the immune system. The connection between mind and body was not fully understood at the time, but the idea that a person's emotional state could manifest physically was gaining traction. Thus, the treatment of loneliness was not just psychological. It was viewed as something that needed to be addressed in a holistic manner, with the body and mind seen as one inseparable unit. The hospital's approach to treating loneliness was, by modern standards, deeply misguided. The treatments, though well-intentioned, were based on the assumption that loneliness could be cured by isolation. This paradox is both fascinating and tragic. The very thing that caused the patient's distress, solitude, was used as a tool for recovery. How could such a deeply emotional and human condition be treated in such a cold, mechanical way? The answer lies in the medical philosophy of the time, which often viewed mental illness through a lens of control and reformation. In an age where society prized conformity and social order, it was not surprising that an institution tasked with treating the mind would resort to rigid, dehumanizing methods. In practice, the treatment of loneliness as a disease involved strict regimens of seclusion and isolation. Patients were often kept in rooms with minimal furnishings and few, if any, personal items. These rooms were deliberately designed to be stark and devoid of emotional comfort. The walls were often bare, the windows small and barred, allowing little light or view of the outside world. The idea was to remove any external stimuli that could distract from the patient's internal struggle. In the eyes of the doctors, this was an opportunity for the patient to confront their loneliness directly. Without the distractions of social interaction, they could, in theory, focus solely on their inner selves and the emotional pain they had been carrying. But the cruel irony of this treatment is that it failed to address the root cause of loneliness. The patients were not being cured, they were being further entrenched in their isolation. Instead of being given the chance to heal through human connection, they were forced to endure the very thing that had brought them to the hospital in the first place. The concept of treating loneliness through isolation, rather than through the healing power of human contact, reflects the deep misunderstanding of the time. The doctors believed that the patient's emotional distress was rooted in an inability to confront their own feelings, and that removing them from society would force them to come to terms with their isolation. Yet, what they failed to realize was that loneliness itself was not something that could be confronted in isolation. It was something that needed to be shared, understood, and treated through empathy and connection. The hospital's treatment methods were not limited to isolation alone. The institution was built on the belief that socialization could cure loneliness, but that socialization had to be strictly controlled. Patients were sometimes grouped together in communal spaces, but these interactions were tightly monitored. The idea was to force patients into socialization under carefully controlled conditions, where their every move was observed. These forced interactions, which were meant to be therapeutic, were often shallow and artificial. The patients were not allowed to form meaningful connections. Instead, they were treated as subjects in an experiment, their every action scrutinized by the staff. In some cases, patients were even encouraged to socialize with strangers, people who were also suffering from the same affliction. However, without the real emotional connection that could come from family or friends, these interactions often felt hollow and strained. Furthermore, the hospital sometimes employed what would now be considered repressive or punitive techniques to cure loneliness. For instance, patients who were seen as not complying with a regimen were punished with further isolation, an even stricter regimen of confinement, or forced labor. These harsh methods were designed to enforce compliance, under the misguided belief that loneliness could be eradicated through discipline and control. The treatment was often counterproductive, as it created a deeper sense of helplessness and despair in the patients, rather than offering them any real opportunity for healing. Yet, despite the inherent cruelty of these methods, the hospital's approach to loneliness was a reflection of its time. At the turn of the century, many in the medical field believed that the mind could be manipulated and controlled, much like any other part of the body. There was little understanding of the nuances of human emotion, and mental health conditions were often treated with a one-size-fits-all approach. The concept of loneliness as a disease was just one example of how the medical profession, in its early stages, failed to grasp the complexity of human experience. Despite the hospital's misguided treatment methods, its existence serves as a chilling reminder of how far the understanding of mental health has come, and how much further there is still to go. Today, loneliness is not treated as a disease in the same way. It is recognized as a complex emotional state, one that can have significant mental and physical health consequences, but also one that requires a more compassionate, humanistic approach. We now understand that loneliness is a symptom of deeper issues, such as depression, trauma, or social disconnection, and we treat it through therapy, community engagement, and support networks, rather than through the cold, isolating practices that define the hospital of the past. The diagnosis of loneliness as a disease, and the treatment methods employed by the hospital, serve as a haunting reminder of how medical science can sometimes get it terribly wrong. But they also offer a glimpse into a time when psychiatric care was still an evolving field, one that was willing to experiment, however misguidedly, in an attempt to address the suffering of those who had no voice. The patients who passed through the doors of that hospital were not just victims of their loneliness, they were also victims of a medical system that had yet to learn how to truly listen. The individuals who founded and operated the hospital that treated loneliness as a disease were, in many ways, a product of their time, medical pioneers driven by a genuine desire to help, yet constrained by the limited knowledge and cultural norms of the late 19th century. These doctors and medical professionals believed they were on the cutting edge of psychiatry, experimenting with new, albeit controversial, ways of treating mental illness. They were part of a broader movement in Victorian medicine to define, diagnose, and treat conditions that had previously been relegated to the realm of the supernatural or moral failing. But while their intentions may have been driven by compassion, Their methods were often born from ignorance, misguided ambition, and an almost dogged obsession with control. At the heart of the hospital's founding were a few key figures, each with their own vision for what psychiatry could accomplish. These were men who saw themselves not only as healers but also as reformers, individuals eager to challenge the prevailing medical orthodoxy. In an era where mental illness was often viewed through the lens of moral and religious failings, these doctors were attempting to reshape the understanding of mental health into something more scientific, if not yet entirely accurate. But this pioneering spirit also came with its own set of dangers. Their deep belief in the power of medical science often led them to view patients less as human beings with complex emotional lives and more as experiments, subjects to be studied, tested, and ultimately reformed. The medical community during the late 1800s was in the midst of a transition from a more spiritual or philosophical approach to mental health to one that was increasingly scientific. This shift was largely driven by figures like Sigmund Freud, whose psychoanalytic theories would revolutionize the way we thought about the mind, but also by a host of other physicians and thinkers who sought to bring psychiatric care into the fold of modern medicine. Asylums and hospitals were popping up across Europe and North America, each claiming to have the answer to the mysteries of mental illness. Yet, the approach taken by the founders of this particular institution was unique in its insistence that loneliness itself could be seen as a medical condition, a disease that could, and should, be treated in a clinical setting. One of the most prominent figures behind the hospital's creation was a respected physician whose background in general medicine had led him to specialize in the emerging field of psychiatry. His early medical career had been marked by a deep curiosity about the human mind, an interest that had led him to study not only traditional medicine but also the psychological theories circulating in Europe at the time. He was drawn to the idea that mental illnesses could be categorized and treated with the same precision as physical diseases. However, his approach to psychiatry was driven by the belief that emotional afflictions, like loneliness, were diseases in the same way that infections or organ failures were. He saw the mind as a fragile, malleable organ, one that could be cured or reformed through strict control and discipline. His clinical approach to loneliness reflected his belief that this emotional state was not simply a passing condition, but a pathology that could distort a person's mental and physical health. This physician, along with several like-minded colleagues, founded the hospital with the belief that a structured, methodical approach to loneliness could yield results. He believed that the isolation of patients, removing them from the distractions of society and other emotional influences, was the key to their recovery. His philosophy was grounded in a somewhat naive optimism that by controlling the environment in which patients lived, he could control the illness itself. There was no room for emotional warmth or empathy in his vision of psychiatric care. Instead, his focus was on creating an environment that stripped away all external influences and forced the patient to confront their condition head-on. He believed that the root of loneliness was the patient's inability to accept their own emotional suffering and that, through isolation, they would eventually confront and overcome this affliction. The physician was not alone in his conviction that loneliness could be treated with isolation. Another key figure involved in the hospital's development was a psychiatrist whose background was in the emerging field of experimental psychology. He had been fascinated by the idea that human behavior could be measured and quantified, much like physical phenomena. This led him to adopt a more mechanistic view of mental health, where emotions like loneliness were seen as disturbances in the body's emotional equilibrium, disruptions that could be corrected through scientific intervention. His approach to the treatment of loneliness was grounded in the idea that the mind could be reset or recalibrated through external conditions. To him, the hospital was a laboratory of sorts, a place where theories could be tested and refined in the real world. Together, these two men and their colleagues created a clinical environment that mirrored their scientific ambitions. The hospital itself was designed to be an extension of their philosophy, with stark, cold rooms meant to strip away any external distractions or comforts. The belief was that by removing patients from their social and familial networks, the emotional toxins of loneliness could be treated. Social interaction was seen as unnecessary and even counterproductive, as the physicians believed it would only reinforce the patient's feelings of isolation and despair. What was needed, they argued, was not connection but a controlled environment in which patients could detoxify from their emotional wounds. The rooms where patients were confined were not places of healing in the traditional sense. Rather, they were cold, impersonal spaces that reflected the medical philosophy of the time, where physical comfort was secondary to the primary goal of reprogramming the mind. As these key figures built their institution, they began to draw a following of other medical professionals who were equally fascinated by the idea of treating loneliness as a disease. Many of these professionals had backgrounds in fields like neurology, endocrinology, and general medicine. They were eager to apply the same clinical methods they had used to treat physical ailments to the human mind. These individuals were not necessarily malicious or uncaring. They genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. But they were also working in an era when mental health care was in its infancy, and their understanding of psychological conditions was limited. They saw loneliness not as a natural human condition but as an emotional sickness that could be eradicated through intervention. Despite their belief in the success of their methods, the founders and physicians of the hospital were not without their critics. In fact, many in the medical community, particularly those with a more humanistic or progressive view of psychiatry, saw the hospital's approach as outdated and harmful. Critics argued that the idea of treating loneliness through isolation was fundamentally flawed, that it ignored the basic human need for connection and empathy. There were also concerns that the harsh, clinical methods employed at the hospital could worsen the patient's conditions, leaving them with lasting emotional scars. These critics, however, were often marginalized by the prevailing medical orthodoxy of the time, which championed the hospital as a breakthrough institution. The battle between these differing views highlighted the tension within the psychiatric field itself, where the boundaries of what constituted appropriate care were still being defined. In some respects, the hospital's founders were ahead of their time, pushing the boundaries of psychiatric treatment in ways that would eventually lead to more compassionate and nuanced approaches to mental health. However, their methods were also a stark reminder of how medical experimentation in the name of progress can go terribly wrong when it lacks an understanding of the human experience. Their faith in isolation as a cure for loneliness, an emotional condition that is inherently tied to human connection, was both an example of their ambition and a tragic flaw in their understanding of the mind. As the years passed and new psychiatric theories began to take hold, the hospital slowly faded from prominence. Its methods, once seen as groundbreaking, were replaced by more humane approaches that acknowledged the importance of social bonds and emotional support in the treatment of mental illness. Yet, the legacy of the hospital remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of reducing complex human experiences to mere medical conditions, and the ways in which well-meaning professionals can lose sight of the very thing they're trying to heal, the human soul. The founders of this hospital, for all their flaws and misguided beliefs, were part of a larger movement that helped shape the field of psychiatry, but their misguided approach to loneliness also left behind a cautionary tale about the limits of medical intervention and the importance of understanding the deeper, more compassionate aspects of human suffering. As the hospital that treated loneliness as a disease began to function and evolve, its impact was felt not only by the patients it housed but also by the larger psychiatric community. Its radical methods, although controversial, forced the medical establishment to confront the very nature of mental illness, emotional suffering, and the boundaries of medical intervention. The doctors and staff at the hospital, firm believers in the curative powers of isolation, were continually seeking ways to refine their treatments. Yet, what began as an experiment in treating loneliness through enforced solitude became something darker, and ultimately, a symbol of the era's misunderstandings about the mind, emotions, and the treatment of mental health. From the outset, the hospital's methods seemed grounded in a strong sense of logic, if not compassion. The assumption was that loneliness, if left untreated, could become a powerful destructive force within the mind, eventually manifesting in deeper psychological disorders. This belief reflected a growing tendency during the Victorian era to medicalize and pathologize various human conditions that had once been considered natural or simply part of the human experience. At the time, the belief that emotional states, such as sadness, anxiety, and loneliness, could be the root cause of mental illness was gaining traction. While this understanding was a step forward in some ways, it also led to the overdiagnosis and misinterpretation of emotional distress. The notion that loneliness was inherently a disease, rather than a symptom or condition that could arise from complex psychological or social factors, reinforced the idea that mental health issues should be treated with absolute control and regimented isolation. Inside the hospital, the most common method of treatment was to place patients in solitary confinement. Initially, this was intended to allow individuals to focus inward, to confront their emotional and psychological states without distractions. The idea was that by removing patients from their social environments, they could be freed from the negative influences of the outside world and given the space to heal. However, what the doctors failed to understand was that isolation, in and of itself, could not lead to healing. For patients suffering from the pain of loneliness, seclusion only deepened their distress. The absence of human connection, once enforced by the institution, did not bring clarity or emotional reconciliation. It caused more suffering, leading to a deterioration of both mental and physical health. This paradox became increasingly apparent as more patients entered the hospital, only to see their conditions worsen under the prescribed regimen. Many of them, instead of recovering from their emotional pain, grew more withdrawn, depressed, and detached from the world around them. The loneliness they had initially sought to escape now seemed to multiply within the cold, sterile walls of their isolation cells. The hospital's physicians, however, were largely unaware of the toll this treatment was taking. Their belief in the curative power of solitude clouded their judgment, and they continued to prescribe longer periods of confinement, convinced that the patient's failure to heal was simply a matter of their resistance to treatment. This treatment method was both alienating and cruel. For those who entered the hospital with hopes of finding respite from their loneliness, the results were tragic. Instead of offering a pathway to recovery, the institution's approach created a suffocating environment where human connection was restricted, and the healing process was stifled. The belief that loneliness could be eradicated through further isolation was fundamentally flawed, yet it persisted for years. Many patients who entered the hospital in search of relief from emotional suffering left worse off than before. The sense of isolation, rather than being a temporary condition to overcome, became an enduring feature of their existence. For many, the experience marked a permanent shift in their mental and emotional state, reinforcing the idea that prolonged solitude could cause long-lasting harm. The idea of isolating individuals suffering from loneliness and expecting them to heal in such an environment ignored the inherent need for human connection. The period's understanding of mental illness was still largely influenced by moral and social frameworks, where patients were often blamed for their own conditions. Loneliness, in this framework, was seen as a moral failing or an inability to properly navigate social relationships. What was missing from the hospital's treatment philosophy was a recognition of the complexity of human emotion. Emotional pain, including loneliness, was not something that could simply be fixed through isolation. It required compassion, understanding, and often, the intervention of human connection, none of which could be provided by the sterile, controlled environment of the hospital. Over time, as more patients arrived and left, the flaws of the hospital's approach became impossible to ignore. While the doctors and staff were initially resistant to outside criticism, the increasing failure of their methods began to raise questions even within the medical community. Some physicians, particularly those with a more humanistic view of psychiatry, began to question the idea that isolation was a cure for loneliness. They observed that patients who were placed in isolation for extended periods seemed to deteriorate rather than recover, and some even began to show symptoms of what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or other trauma-related conditions. The emotional and psychological toll of forced seclusion began to outweigh the intended benefits, and it became increasingly clear that this form of treatment was not only ineffective but harmful. As the medical community began to recognize the flaws in the hospital's approach, new methods of treating loneliness were proposed. These new methods were grounded in the understanding that emotional suffering, including loneliness, required connection and support to heal. Therapy, social support, and community engagement began to replace isolation as treatment options. However, these new ideas were not widely accepted overnight. The field of psychiatry was still evolving, and there were many entrenched beliefs that persisted within the medical establishment. But slowly, over the years, the hospital that treated loneliness as a disease was forced to adapt. New leadership, along with a growing body of research on mental health, began to push for more humane and effective treatments for loneliness. By the turn of the 20th century, the prevailing medical belief about loneliness was shifting. It was increasingly recognized that isolation could exacerbate mental health conditions rather than heal them. The emerging fields of psychology and psychiatry were focusing more on the importance of human interaction, emotional support, and the role of community in mental health. Institutions like the hospital in question began to experiment with new approaches, incorporating these ideas into their treatments. Group therapy, communal activities, and a focus on reintegrating patients back into society became central to the hospital's revised approach. However, the legacy of the hospital and its methods could not be so easily erased. The institution's role in the history of mental health treatment serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the dangers of treating complex emotional states with overly simplistic methods. The very idea that loneliness could be reduced to a mere disease, something to be cured through isolation, remains a stark reminder of the limitations of early psychiatric thought. The hospital's treatment methods may have been a product of their time, but they also represent a failure to understand the deep, interconnected nature of human experience. As the hospital's treatments became increasingly recognized as ineffective, the institution's reputation began to decline. Its methods were increasingly viewed as outdated and unethical, particularly as the field of psychiatry progressed and new, more compassionate approaches to mental health emerged. But the memory of this hospital lingers as a poignant reminder of the dark side of psychiatry in the 19th century, a time when emotional suffering was often seen through a lens of moral failure rather than a complex interplay of psychological, social, and biological factors. The mistakes made in this institution, and the suffering endured by the patients who passed through its doors, ultimately laid the foundation for the more compassionate and scientifically grounded mental health treatments we have today. The legacy of the hospital is, therefore, a bittersweet one, a testament to both the progress made in the field of psychiatry and the deep scars left by an era of misunderstanding and experimentation. As the hospital continued to operate, the legacy of its treatment methods began to take shape in ways that were both troubling and insightful. While many of the physicians involved in its establishment remained convinced of the efficacy of their practices, cracks were beginning to show in their theories, and patients who passed through its doors became part of a larger narrative about the dangers of unchecked medical experimentation. The very nature of the hospital, which was initially designed as a beacon of hope for those suffering from loneliness, was slowly transformed into a symbol of medical hubris, an institution that promised relief but often delivered more harm than good. The idea that loneliness could be treated as a disease, isolated from the broader human experience, was grounded in a misunderstanding of the very nature of emotional suffering. It was an attempt to impose order on something inherently chaotic and deeply personal. Loneliness, as the hospital's founders argued, was not merely a transient emotional state but a pathological condition that could sap a person's strength and even lead to insanity if left untreated. Yet this view, while grounded in the emerging ideas of the time, failed to recognize the complex, multifaceted nature of human emotion. Loneliness was not a singular, fixed condition. It was an experience that could take on many different forms, from the social isolation of the elderly to the profound existential solitude that comes with loss, trauma, or depression. But the hospital's treatment, focused on isolation as the primary therapeutic method, could not account for these variations. This fundamental flaw became more apparent as the institution grew in size and scope. The hospital, which had once been a place of pioneering treatments for loneliness, became a microcosm of Victorian attitudes toward mental illness. Rather than exploring the emotional or psychological roots of loneliness, the hospital's practitioners focused on its physical manifestations, seeing it as something that could be fixed with the right amount of isolation, routine, and control. But by failing to understand loneliness as a complex emotional experience that was deeply influenced by personal, social, and cultural factors, the physicians missed the mark entirely. The result was an institution that treated the symptoms of emotional distress in ways that were, at best, superficial and, at worst, damaging. The patients who entered the hospital were often isolated not only from their families and loved ones but also from any real support systems. The belief that isolation was the cure for loneliness became deeply ingrained in the hospital's culture. Patients were treated as though their emotional suffering could be erased by simply being removed from the world around them. The strict regimens of solitary confinement, the sterile, emotionless rooms, and the absence of human interaction all reinforced the idea that the solution to loneliness was separation. For many patients, however, this treatment only deepened their despair. Instead of helping them face their emotional challenges, it caused them to internalize their pain, reinforcing the idea that they were alone and isolated in a world that had no place for them. The hospital's treatment regimen was not only emotionally harmful but also physically detrimental to many patients. The prolonged periods of isolation and lack of human interaction had profound effects on the body as well as the mind. Patients who were left in solitary confinement for extended periods often suffered from a range of physical ailments, including weight loss, fatigue, and a weakening immune system. The stress of isolation, coupled with the lack of emotional support, took a serious toll on their overall health. Yet, the medical staff at the hospital, focused as they were on treating loneliness as a disease, overlooked these physical symptoms. They viewed the patient's suffering as a necessary part of the process, an unfortunate but ultimately essential step toward healing. What they failed to recognize was that emotional and physical health were interconnected, and that emotional neglect often manifested in physical illness. The emotional toll of isolation was not the only consequence of the hospital's approach. For many of the patients, the experience of being treated for loneliness in such a cold, clinical setting had a long-lasting psychological impact. Many patients left the hospital not feeling healed but broken, more isolated than before, with their emotional distress compounded by the trauma of their treatment. For some, the hospital became a place where their sense of self-worth was shattered. The lack of human connection, combined with the harsh, dehumanizing methods of care, left them with a deep sense of hopelessness and despair. The loneliness they had sought to escape only grew deeper, as they were forced to confront the painful reality that the medical establishment, which was supposed to help them, had instead exacerbated their suffering. The medical staff at the hospital, though well-meaning, were not immune to the limitations of their own worldview. Their belief in the power of isolation as a curative force was rooted in a broader cultural and medical context that valued control, discipline, and separation. This was an era when the idea of individual autonomy was not fully embraced, and the medical community still held onto the belief that doctors were the ultimate authority over the lives of their patients. The idea that patients could heal through controlled environments was part of this larger medical mindset, which sought to impose order on the chaos of the human mind. But this approach ignored the inherent unpredictability of human emotions. It overlooked the fact that healing often comes not through isolation, but through connection, through understanding, compassion, and support. As the years passed and the hospital's methods continued to be questioned, new developments in the field of psychiatry began to emerge. The growing body of research in psychology and mental health highlighted the importance of emotional support, social connection, and community in the treatment of loneliness and other mental health conditions. The idea that human beings were inherently social creatures, whose mental and emotional health was deeply intertwined with their relationships to others, began to take root. This new understanding began to shift the medical community away from the harsh, isolating methods employed by the hospital and toward a more holistic, compassionate approach to mental health. Yet, even as the medical profession began to move toward more progressive methods of treatment, the hospital's legacy lingered. Its approach to loneliness as a disease left a mark on the history of psychiatry, illustrating the dangers of oversimplifying complex human experiences and of treating emotional suffering without truly understanding its causes. The hospital's role in the medical community gradually diminished as its methods were increasingly discredited, but its impact remained as a cautionary tale of the perils of overzealous medical intervention. Today, the notion that loneliness can be treated as a disease in the way the hospital once believed has been largely abandoned. Modern psychiatry recognizes loneliness as a complex emotional state that can be influenced by a variety of factors, including psychological, social, and environmental conditions. Treatments for loneliness now emphasize connection, social support, therapy, and community involvement, rather than isolation. The focus is no longer on curing loneliness through seclusion, but on addressing the underlying causes of the emotional distress that often leads to isolation. The rise and fall of the hospital that treated loneliness as a disease highlights the evolution of psychiatric thought and the dangers of reducing complex emotional experiences to simple medical diagnoses. It is a reminder of the importance of empathy, understanding, and connection in the treatment of mental health. The lessons learned from this institution's misguided approach to loneliness have helped shape the more humane and scientifically grounded mental health practices we have today. But they also serve as a somber reminder of the dark chapters in the history of psychiatry, chapters where the pursuit of scientific progress often came at the cost of human dignity and well-being. The patients who suffered in their hospital, and the legacy of its failed treatments, are part of a broader story of how psychiatry, like all sciences, is a field in constant evolution, one that must be guided by compassion as much as it is by theory. As the hospital that treated loneliness as a disease began to shift its focus from isolation to more modern treatments, it found itself at the crossroads of a medical revolution. New theories and practices were emerging, which promised more humane and effective methods for addressing the emotional suffering that had long been neglected or misunderstood. The world of psychiatry was evolving rapidly during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as new understandings of the human mind and its complexities began to take shape. This period marked the beginning of the end for the institution's once groundbreaking practices, even as it remained a critical turning point in the history of mental health care. At the heart of this transformation was the increasing recognition that emotional pain, such as the loneliness that had initially brought many to the hospital, was not simply a symptom to be treated through isolation, but a complex emotional and social phenomenon that required a more nuanced approach. The burgeoning fields of psychology and social science were beginning to reshape the way mental illness was perceived, moving away from rigid, one-size-fits-all treatments and toward a deeper understanding of the mind's intricate relationship with society, culture, and personal history. These emerging theories brought a critical shift in the way patients suffering from loneliness would be treated in the future. The first cracks in the hospital's approach appeared in the form of new psychiatric research and psychological theory. Psychoanalysis, pioneered by Sigmund Freud, had begun to gain traction across Europe. Freud's ideas about the unconscious mind, repression, and the complexities of human sexuality challenged the conventional wisdom about emotional and mental health. Freud argued that mental disorders, including depression and anxiety, were rooted in unresolved internal conflicts, often stemming from childhood experiences or repressed emotions. This perspective was radically different from the earlier view that mental illness could be explained in purely biological terms or simply as a moral failing. For Freud and other early psychoanalysts, the mind was not a mere vessel to be controlled. It was a dynamic force, shaped by unconscious processes that could be explored, understood, and, ultimately, healed. In the context of loneliness, psychoanalysis would eventually offer a more compassionate and layered understanding of the condition. Instead of viewing loneliness as an isolated and straightforward disease that could be treated through seclusion, psychoanalysis suggested that it was a manifestation of deeper psychological struggles. Loneliness, in this view, was not just the absence of others, but a symptom of unresolved emotional wounds, whether from early childhood trauma, an inability to form meaningful relationships, or the repression of deep-seated feelings of inadequacy or shame. By exploring the root causes of these feelings, often through talk therapy, psychoanalysis offered a way to treat loneliness not by isolating the patient further, but by fostering insight and understanding of the emotional and psychological mechanisms at play. As psychoanalysis and other psychological approaches began to influence the field of psychiatry, the hospital's once pioneering methods began to be seen as outdated and ineffective. Increasingly, there was a call for a more holistic approach to mental health that took into account the complexity of human emotions, social relationships, and individual histories. Doctors and psychiatrists began to understand that loneliness was not merely a condition to be cured by separating the individual from the world, but something that needed to be addressed within the context of the person's relationships, life experiences, and sense of self-worth. This growing awareness led to the introduction of more integrative treatment methods in mental health care. Asylums and psychiatric hospitals, which had once been places of confinement and punishment, slowly started to incorporate ideas of rehabilitation, community support, and, most importantly, human connection. New therapies, including group therapy and individual psychotherapy, began to gain popularity as they offered patients a chance to confront their loneliness through social interaction and emotional exploration. The focus shifted from simply curing loneliness through isolation to understanding the emotional and psychological sources of that loneliness, and providing patients with the tools and support they needed to navigate their feelings in healthier, more constructive ways. This new approach was supported by a growing body of research in the emerging fields of sociology, psychology, and social work. The importance of social relationships in maintaining mental health became widely recognized, with experts like John Bowlby contributing to the understanding of attachment theory, which suggested that early emotional bonds, particularly those with caregivers, were fundamental to a person's emotional well-being. The idea that humans are social beings, and that loneliness could stem from an inability to form or maintain meaningful relationships, began to gain traction. This understanding aligned with the growing recognition that human suffering, whether emotional or physical, was never simply a biological or isolated issue, but one deeply intertwined with the fabric of society. For the hospital, however, the transition to these newer, more progressive treatments was a slow and painful process. Its legacy of isolation and control could not be undone overnight, and many of its staff were deeply entrenched in the methods that had built the institution. The belief that loneliness could be treated as a distinct disease, something to be eradicated through confinement and discipline, was not easily shaken. But as new generations of psychiatrists began to take the lead, a gradual shift began to take place. The very philosophy of treating loneliness as a disease started to give way to the recognition that loneliness was an emotional state, one that, like any other human feeling, required empathy, understanding, and the appropriate social and psychological support. The hospital, over time, started to experiment with new methods of treatment. Rather than isolating patients entirely, the staff began to introduce group therapies, where patients could share their feelings and experiences with others in a controlled setting. Though still very much in its infancy, group therapy offered a new avenue for patients to address their loneliness in a collective, supportive environment. Slowly, patients were encouraged to reconnect with the world outside the hospital, to re-establish ties with their families, and to develop a sense of belonging that was not dependent on isolation. The emphasis shifted from control and confinement to communication and healing. However, these changes were not universally embraced, and the institution's shift toward more compassionate treatment often met resistance from those who had long championed the old methods. There were still many doctors and staff who believed that the true cure for loneliness lay in enforced solitude, not in socializing or engaging with others. This internal division mirrored the larger struggle within the psychiatric community, a struggle between the old guard, who had invested their careers in the belief that mental health could be controlled through rigid methods, and the new wave of thought leaders, who believed that emotional suffering could not be cured by isolation but by reintegration into society and deep emotional exploration. The hospital's transformation was also a reflection of broader social changes. The Victorian ideals of discipline, control, and moral righteousness, which had underpinned so much of the original treatment philosophy, began to lose their grip on society. The more progressive, humanistic attitudes of the early 20th century, which emphasized individual rights, emotional expression, and social equality, began to take root. These shifts were not only occurring within the psychiatric community but also in the broader cultural understanding of mental health. The notion that mental illness was not a moral failing, but a condition that could be treated with empathy, understanding, and science, became a guiding principle for modern psychiatry. Despite the eventual decline of the hospital's methods, its role in the evolution of psychiatric treatment should not be entirely dismissed. Its existence and the debate surrounding its practices were part of the larger conversation about how to treat mental illness in a world that was still grappling with the complexities of the human mind. The hospital's approach to loneliness as a disease reflected a moment in time when psychiatry was still trying to understand how best to heal the human soul. Though its methods were ultimately proven to be misguided and harmful, they also forced the medical community to confront the limitations of their understanding of the mind and the social aspects of emotional suffering. In the end, the hospital that treated loneliness as a disease became a cautionary tale, illustrating both the potential and the danger of medical intervention when the complexities of the human experience are oversimplified. Today, the treatment of loneliness, though still a difficult and often misunderstood aspect of mental health, is much more sophisticated, focusing on therapy, social support, and meaningful connections. The lessons learned from the hospital's misguided methods continue to inform the field of psychiatry, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated and that patients suffering from loneliness are treated with the care and compassion they deserve. As the hospital's reputation continued to wane, it became increasingly clear that its methods, once heralded as groundbreaking, were now viewed as relics of a darker and less informed era. The patients who had once entered its doors with the hope of overcoming their loneliness had become part of a much larger narrative, one that highlighted the dangers of reducing complex emotional states to a mere medical condition, something to be cured through isolation. The institution's legacy, though tarnished by its failure to address the true nature of emotional suffering, nevertheless left a mark on the psychiatric community. The hospital's mistakes, its well-intentioned but ultimately harmful approach to treating loneliness, paved the way for more compassionate, evidence-based methods in the field of mental health. It is essential to understand that while the hospital's treatments were based on a misguided view of loneliness, they also reflected the growing pains of psychiatry itself. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were periods of profound transformation in the world of psychiatry. The burgeoning fields of psychology, sociology, and social work all began to shift the focus of mental health treatment from purely biological or moral frameworks to more dynamic, holistic approaches. What had once been seen as a moral failing or weakness, emotions like loneliness, grief, or despair, was gradually recognized as part of the human condition, deeply intertwined with the complexities of personal experience and societal context. The field of psychiatry, once rooted in rigid, one-dimensional views of mental illness, began to open itself up to the idea that emotional suffering could not simply be classified as a disease to be eradicated. It required empathy, understanding, and, most importantly, human connection. The hospital, in its attempt to cure loneliness by cutting people off from the world around them, was not only overlooking the essential role of human relationships in emotional health but was also disregarding the very essence of what it meant to be human. The treatment regimen focused on isolation as the solution to emotional suffering, ignoring the reality that loneliness often stems from a deep need for connection and community. The belief that physical separation from others could cure emotional distress was rooted in a reductionist view of mental health, one that saw emotional and psychological pain as problems to be fixed rather than complex experiences to be understood and treated with care. One of the most significant failings of the hospital's treatment approach was its complete disregard for the role that human relationships play in emotional well-being. The isolation that patients experienced was not just a lack of interaction with the outside world. It was the absence of support, of understanding, of empathy. Loneliness, especially when it becomes chronic, is often linked to a sense of disconnection from others, a feeling of being cut off from the social fabric that gives life meaning. Yet, by further isolating these individuals, the hospital inadvertently deepened this sense of disconnection. Instead of treating the root cause of their loneliness, which was the absence of connection and meaningful interaction, The hospital exacerbated the problem by creating an environment that stripped away the very thing they needed most: human contact. This disconnect between the hospital's medical approach and the emotional needs of its patients was a reflection of the broader medical mindset of the time. The late 19th century saw psychiatry slowly shifting from a moralistic framework to a more scientific one. The idea of mental illness as something to be understood and treated through rational means was gaining traction, but this shift came with its own limitations. Medical professionals, in their eagerness to apply scientific methods to mental health, often overlooked the deeply personal and emotional aspects of the human experience. The hospital's approach, though well-intentioned, was rooted in a misunderstanding of the nature of emotional suffering and a lack of empathy for the very people it sought to help. As new ideas and treatments began to emerge, the hospital's methods fell further out of favor. The growing acceptance of psychoanalysis and other psychological treatments offered a more nuanced understanding of loneliness. Rather than viewing it as a disease to be eradicated, these new approaches recognized that loneliness was often a symptom of deeper psychological issues that could be addressed through therapy, social support, and emotional exploration. This paradigm shift in psychiatry signaled a move away from rigid, clinical methods of treatment and toward a more human-centered approach, one that acknowledged the complexities of mental health and the importance of emotional connection. One of the key figures in the shift away from the hospital's methods was Sigmund Freud. His theories on the unconscious mind, repression, and the importance of early childhood experiences laid the foundation for a new understanding of emotional suffering. Freud's work, though controversial and still debated today, offered a more comprehensive framework for understanding mental health. His theories suggested that loneliness, like other forms of emotional distress, was not simply a matter of isolation, but a manifestation of deeper psychological conflict. Rather than isolating patients to force them to confront their emotions, psychoanalysis encouraged patients to explore their inner worlds, to uncover repressed memories and emotions that were causing their suffering. In this way, loneliness was not something to be fixed by physical separation, but something to be understood and worked through in the context of the individual psyche. The shift in psychiatric thought was not limited to Freud. Other thinkers, such as Carl Jung, emphasized the importance of social relationships and the need for individuals to integrate their emotions into their overall sense of self. Jung's ideas about the collective unconscious and the role of archetypes in shaping human experience further emphasized the importance of connection, not just with other people, but with the deeper, often unconscious parts of the self. Jung's theory suggested that loneliness could arise when individuals were disconnected from their own inner truths or from a shared human experience. Healing, therefore, involved more than just addressing the external circumstances of isolation. It involved reconnecting with oneself and with others on a profound, psychological level. As these new ideas gained traction in the psychiatric community, the hospital's approach began to look more and more outdated. The belief that loneliness could be treated through enforced solitude, devoid of emotional or social context, was increasingly recognized as misguided. The realization that emotional suffering was often rooted in complex, personal, and social factors that could not be addressed through isolation, led to the development of more compassionate and effective treatments. Psychiatry began to move away from a strictly medical model, where patients were treated as subjects to be controlled, and toward a more integrated, therapeutic model, where patients were seen as individuals with unique emotional and psychological needs. The legacy of the hospital that treated loneliness as a disease, however, remains important in the history of psychiatry. It serves as a reminder of the dangers of oversimplifying complex emotional states and of the tendency to treat patients as problems to be fixed, rather than individuals to be understood.